Did you know there were 3 messengers of the Most High whose very presence made even the adversary bow in silence? Before the first stone of Eden was set, before dust was breathed into man, there was a court of light where all voices rose in perfect harmony. Yet, within that brilliance, 3 stood nearer to the throne than the rest, not by flattery, but by divine assignment. Their closeness was not ornamental, it was dangerous. In the prophet's vision it is written, "You were the anointed cherub who covers. You were on the holy mountain of God." Ezekiel 28:14. But what the scroll leaves unspoken is that there were powers stationed closer still, silent sentinels whose offices would one day make the Satan yield. Few speak of them now. The oldest commentaries that hinted at their ranks are locked in monastery vaults. Their stories, when told at all, are scattered like broken seal fragments across the canon and the forgotten books. Yet the pattern remains, waiting for those who will trace it. Why were they placed there? Why was their proximity the one thing ambition could not breach? And why has their role been cut from the record in most pulpits? Stay with us, because to uncover the truth, we must first return to the courts before time, where reverence began to fracture, and a single thought would change eternity. And if you're new here, welcome to Timeless Bible Tales. Subscribe, and let me know where you're listening from in the comments. The courts of light were not silent, yet every sound was perfect. Each note of praise rose and folded into the next until the air itself seemed woven from worship. Cherubim flanked the throne, their 4 faces glinting like hammered gold, wings touching above as if to seal the presence in living arches. Seraphim circled in slow, unbroken orbits, their voices calling, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts, the whole earth is full of his glory." Isaiah 6:3. The sound was not loud, yet it shook the foundations of the place. Beneath them, the Svaot, the hosts of heaven, stood in ordered ranks, each face lifted toward the radiance that no creature could look upon and remain unchanged. Some bore the fire of messengers, some the stillness of watchmen, some the strength of warriors, poised but at rest. Between their ranks ran currents of anticipation, like the hush before an orchestra's first strike. The sea before the throne was like crystal, clear yet unfathomable, reflecting light from no source but the one enthroned. Lampstands burned in constellations, their flames fixed. The scent of frankincense rich in the air, though no smoke trailed upward. This was the order before man, before sin, hierarchy without rivalry, splendor without pride. Lucifer was among the most admired. Ezekiel's vision recalls such a one. Every precious stone was your covering. The workmanship of your timbrels and pipes was prepared for you on the day you were created. Ezekiel 28:13. An anointed cherub, walking among the stones of fire, entrusted with guardianship, carrying reflected glory. His form was like the dawn caught in crystal, his voice like strings drawn from unseen harps. Even so, his station, exalted though it was, did not reach the place nearest the throne. 3 others stood there. Their names are not given openly in the Torah or the prophets without effort to find them. One must gather the fragments from Daniel's visions, the Annunciations in Luke, and the Old Greek text of Tobit, preserved in Catholic, Orthodox, and Ethiopian canons. These 3 were nearer, not because they were favourites, but because their very offices demanded proximity: war, word, and restoration. Those were their functions, though later copyists softened the terms. Some of the oldest glosses that hinted at their precise stations were cut from the record, replaced with vague titles in the margins. Fragments remain in monastery vaults, vellum pages flaking under centuries of dust. In the surviving apocryphal writings, Michael is seen as defender, Gabriel as herald, Raphael as healer. But here, in the courts before man, they stood as pillars between the throne and every other rank. To be that near was dangerous, for what stands closest to the king must act instantly on his command. Michael's was the presence of the sword, unyielding, waiting. Gabriel bore the weight of decrees, speech that could build or unmake. Raphael carried the balm that could restore what rebellion broke. Together, their proximity formed a living perimeter no ambition could breach. We were never meant to notice this detail, or so the history of preaching would suggest. Few sermons speak of a triad whose combined offices marked the true boundary of heaven's order. Fewer still ask why this arrangement has been veiled, hidden in smoke-stained margins or in texts now considered non-essential. But there it is, written for those who will piece it together. Think of it. If you stood among the hosts and saw such an arrangement, 3 flames before the throne, one of war, one of word, one of restoration, would you see a shield or an obstacle? Would you feel secure or excluded? And what of the one who was admired by all but stood a step further away? Perhaps that is why certain ancient scribes let their ink grow faint when copying these passages. Perhaps that is why later councils spoke little of angelic order, fearing speculation, and in doing so, cut away part of the tapestry. A silence imposed can feel like safety, but it can also be the first move in erasing memory. The order of heaven was flawless. Every station knew its place, every voice its note. Yet perfection can be looked at too long, and in that gaze a thought may come, quiet, harmless looking at first. A thought like a mirror, wondering if it might be the sun. What happens when admiration is no longer content to reflect? At first it was nothing more than a passing shadow across the light, a faint distortion in the perfect harmony of the chords. The song continued. The ranks remained in place, yet something in the air changed. Lucifer still moved with the ease of one admired by all, still bore the beauty that drew other eyes toward him, yet his gaze no longer rested solely upon the throne. He began to watch the 3 who stood nearer, the ones whose very closeness seemed carved into the architecture of heaven's order. Their nearness was no indulgence, it was assignment. In them, proximity meant readiness, yet readiness, to the mind that begins to hunger for more, can appear as privilege. And so the questions began. They were not voiced as defiance, they came as musings shared in corridors of light, in the quiet moments when the praise paused, and the silence between songs was deep enough for other words to enter. Why divide what could be united? Could not a single hand carry the force of battle, the voice of decree, and the balm of healing more efficiently than 3 separate offices? Would not such unification serve the throne more perfectly? He asked these things gently, as if seeking counsel, and many listened without fear. For in the courts before sin, suspicion had no soil in which to grow. It is here that the record, when pieced together from the canon and the older writings, allows us to speak their names aloud. The first was Michael, the warrior, called in Daniel the great prince who stands guard over the sons of Israel, shown in John's revelation leading the host that casts the dragon down. The second was Gabriel, the messenger of decrees, who came to Daniel to explain visions, and to Zechariah and Mary to herald the events that would divide history itself. The third was Raphael, the restorer, named in the ancient Greek text of Tobit, as the healer sent to drive out the spirit that tormented and to open the blind eyes of the righteous, a tradition preserved in Catholic, Orthodox, and Ethiopian canons, though often marked as speculative in Protestant teaching. Together they stood as a living perimeter of authority, an unbreachable line between the throne and all else. Few mention this now. Some of the oldest commentaries that hinted at their stations survive only in fragments kept in monastery vaults, their parchment cracking at the fold, the ink faded to near invisibility. One codex, copied in the early 4th century, speaks of 3 flames nearest the holy, but the page has been torn across the line. The next sentence lost. We were not meant, it seems, to dwell on such arrangements, yet the pattern remains for those willing to gather it from the scattered leaves. Lucifer noticed more than most. Michael's stillness troubled him, for stillness implies readiness, and readiness implies the expectation of action. Gabriel's voice was too certain, the kind of certainty that could shatter any rival plan before it formed. Raphael's gaze was worst of all, for it held no fear of him and seemed always to be measuring the wound beneath the surface of his thoughts. These were not enemies, not yet, but their very existence denied his unspoken ambition. Among the younger watchers, the ones newly entered into service, whispers began to circulate. A scribe named Elion, whose task was to carry the smaller decrees from Gabriel's station to the teaching halls, later told in hushed tones how he had heard the morning star himself speak of a day when all light shall flow into one vessel. Others recall seeing Lucifer pause in the great hall of crystal mirrors, where the reflections of the host could be seen stretching to infinity. There he lingered, gazing at his own image, as if testing whether the light within it could grow without the throne. In those days the triad saw what was forming. Michael moved to meet it first, his eyes fixed, his posture neither aggressive nor yielding. The presence of the sword was in him, though his hands were empty. Gabriel followed with the word, not a new word but the old decree. No creature rises above its appointment. His voice carried the weight of the same truth spoken to Daniel centuries later. The vision is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. Raphael came last, stepping forward with an appeal to turn back while the path was still open. In his tone was the promise of wholeness, of cleansing, of a return to joy if the ambition was abandoned before it hardened into rebellion. But pride travels as wisdom. In the oldest apocryphal traditions of the Watchers, the descent to earth was justified as a mission of enlightenment for mankind, yet the result was corruption. So, it was here. The arguments seemed noble to the untested, for what harm could there be in improvement? And who among the hosts would suspect deception in a place where deceit had never existed? Perhaps this is why certain scrolls, copied in later centuries, show faint smudges over the names of the three. Perhaps this is why some councils after the early church warned against excessive anglology, as if to speak too clearly of such ranks might open a door better kept locked. You and I must ask, is that lock meant to protect the truth, or to keep it from us? And if a boundary in heaven is hidden from the faithful, what else might have been cut from the record in the name of preserving unity? The murmurs spread, too soft for open alarm, but enough to change the way some looked at the triad when they passed. Not everyone noticed, but those who did felt an unease they could not name. The air was still bright, the songs still flawless, yet beneath it ran a current that was not praise. And so the question becomes ours as much as theirs. What does holy love do when loyalty tilts but has not yet fallen? Can truth spoken plainly turn back a heart already leaning away? Or must the mirror that longs to be the sun see its own image broken before it understands the light was never its own? It happened in the open court, where light fell in slow sheets from the throne and the air trembled with living power. The murmurs that once clung to corridors gathered there, drawn by a voice that had learned the cadence of certainty. Lucifer spoke without veil. His suggestions had hardened into claim. "I will rise," he said, not in those exact syllables to every ear, yet the meaning rang as clear as metal. Isaiah preserves the boast. You know the line, "I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High." We were never meant to hear the tremor in that vow, the way beauty sharpens when desire turns toward the self. The younger hosts looked to the three. Waiting hung in the air like a drawn breath. Michael moved first. The calm that had been readiness became iron. His voice was level, and every syllable carried verdict. The Lord alone is worthy. The boundary stands. The order will not move. Gabriel followed, and in him there was no softness left for negotiation. The decree was not new. It was eternal. No creature may rise above appointment. No will may overrule the word. You must hear this, because our age loves revision. In heaven the sentence was already sealed. Raphael came last, and the change in tone was like water on heated stone. He did not accuse. He pleaded. Turn back while the light still guides your feet. Let the wound be bound before it hardens into a scar. I can help you, he said, and those words were not weakness but courage in a different form. For a breath, the fragrance of incense seemed sweeter, as if mercy itself had leaned forward to listen. Why does heaven confront before it casts out? We ask because you and I live under the same question. Is warning given so that no mouth can claim it was not told? Or is it because the king loves even the enemy with a love that refuses to lie? Remember this moment. But the next part was scraped from more than one copy, a palimpsest where older lines were knifed thin beneath newer ink. And here the silence becomes deliberate. Michael spoke again, this time not to persuade but to invoke. The Lord rebuke you. Jude records the phrase when Michael contends over the body of Moses, and the pattern is the same here. He does not trust in rank. He stands under the name, a title we use for the authority of God himself. The line appeared where speech touched reality, white as first morning, a seam cut across the crystal floor. Those nearest felt the air tighten, as if law had become tangible atmosphere. And you, do you sense how the battlefield changes when the word is named? In Job, the adversary moves only with leave. In Zechariah, the accuser is silenced by the rebuke of the Lord. In the Gospels, unclean spirits beg and obey. The logic is legal before it is violent. Hell yields to jurisdiction it cannot annul. Fragments of this scene survive in odd places. Catalogue entries gone missing, folios worm-eaten, bindings split, notes rubbed thin by many hands. A single line in a Syriac margin mentions fire traced like a thread. Another speaks of seals cracked with old wax. You were raised to think such details are ornamental, but they are evidence. This is where order held firm, and the record learned to whisper. Gabriel closed the matter. His words fell like a door coming to rest. No creature rises above appointment. The decree stands, and it will not be reopened. Raphael answered with tears that did not show, a sorrow carried as light. If you turn, you will be whole. If you refuse, the wound will own you. Hear me while there is day. Pride listened, and called mercy a trap. Desire stared at the shining seam and named it insult. An unnamed courier from the teaching halls would later say he saw Lucifer lower his eyes, not in humility, but to watch the line itself, as if calculation could measure what reverence accepts. You feel the implication, do you not? Boundary is a word our age distrusts. Yet in heaven, it is another name for love. But this next piece was charred on the corner of a later copy, a margin eaten by damp, a sentence no longer legible. The witnesses agreed on the essence. The charge was answered, the court held, and the rebel would not bow. Michael waited, not because he doubted, but because he obeyed. The command to strike had not yet gone forth. Gabriel stood with him, eyes like steady flame. Elohim, a Hebrew word used for spiritual beings and for God himself according to context, was the name on his tongue, and so the halls shook with meaning. Raphael lingered near the edge of the seam, the way a healer stays near a threshold, ready if a patient turns back. He whispered a prayer none of us will read in full, for the letters that once carried it were rubbed away by reverent fingers in a library that no longer stands. Consider this, because you live where the pattern repeats. When the word is spoken, war stands ready, and the offer of restoration shines like a door left ajar. If you remove anyone, the others do not hold. That is why history seems to lose pieces, why certain sermons glide past this line as if it were decoration. And here is the quiet hook the archivist would not approve. The catalogue once listed a second account of the rebuke, but the entry was struck through in brown ink, the thread torn from the binding. Tell me, do you recognize what is happening to your heart when you hear these things? Awe rises, dread follows, then comes a small hope, because order holds. Ambition looks at hope and calls it a chain. Choose which voice you will keep. The choice was made. Ambition refused the offered road back. From this line, the only path remaining is war. It began like the sudden breath before a storm breaks. The court that had held its stillness, shuddering, as ranks shifted with one intent. In the heart of that intent stood Michael. No sword yet drawn, only the certainty that summons swords into being. A low thunder crossed the crystal sea as his voice rose, and the hosts, long trained for readiness, became a river of light turning toward the rebel. Revelation remembers it. There was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought the dragon, and the dragon fought back, but they were not strong enough, and no place was found for them. John preserved that vision under Rome's shadow, binding past and future into a single thread. You can almost hear it, storms of wings, the hiss of falling stars, and in that silence where the rebel stood, Gabriel advanced like a judge reading the verdict, not for love of conflict, but because the decree was his charge to deliver. Early copies gave him words that later scribes softened, yet the meaning survives. The exile is lawful, signed under the name that cannot be appealed. Do you see the pattern? Word first, then war, then restoration. Each close enough to the throne to act without delay, each a barrier ambition cannot slip through. The clash was not chaos, it was order answering disorder, like a chord correcting a false note. Michael's command moved through the ranks as light through a lens. A young watcher, grazed by a fragment of fire, later said it was the first time he had felt fear. Not paralyzing, but clarifying, the kind that fixes the heart on what is worth dying to defend. Gabriel's last sentence fell like a seal cooling into stone. The adversary is removed from this place. Adversary, Satan, the accuser in the court, powerless when the judge speaks. Even you have seen him obey the limits of that court, asking permission in Job, silenced in Zechariah when the Lord rebukes, begging before Jesus when the kingdom breaks in. Michael pressed the rebels to the rim of heaven's floor. The dragon raged, not only in hatred, but in the sorrow of a greatness turned against its source. Stars peeled away behind him. Then came the fall. It did not look like a leap, but like weight reclaiming what tried to float by its own will. Down became a word with teeth. Some ancient hands tried to record the sound, like wind over bronze, or thunder that moves in and out at once. But the page that joined them is gone. We were taught casting down means erasure, but Scripture refuses that comfort. Exile is not annihilation. It preserves the stage where the accuser still walks until the appointed end, which is why he speaks again in Job, in the Gospels, and in visions yet to be. Raphael went where the wounds were, not only of light and flesh, but of spirit, steadying ranks that had seen betrayal face to face. He bound what could have scarred, closed the breaches fear had made, spoke to the trembling watcher, "Be still, the king has not moved." When he touched the wound, it cooled like iron in water. An Ethiopian lectionary calls him the binder of what rebellion tears. Speculative to some, truer than silence to others. Restoration is part of war, not its aftermath, and the healed rank holds the line more firmly than before. Above, Gabriel lifted the decree for all to see, light flaring like a wall no argument could climb. He did not debate. He ended it. That is his office, to announce what is so, like sunrise announcing morning. The light steadied in the court as the door ceased moving. Records thin here on purpose, a gloss erased with pumice, a folio gone in a monastery fire, because to see the pattern is to feel the strategy. Word, war, restoration. And patterns can be imitated by those who love the king. Fear had its moment, sobering even the loyal. Then came ferocity, clean and contained, refusing to hate even when it struck. Relief followed like rain after drought, not theatrical, simply the return of trust. Michael stood at the rim, not looking down in triumph, but inward, checking the line. Gabriel closed the scroll case. If scroll describes a thing that glows, and set it by the throne for the day, it will be read again. Raphael walked the floor, and the tremor left where he passed, as if the ground itself needed reassurance. And here is the truth most omit. Casting down did not silence the rebel. It relocated him. If he fell, why does he still speak later? What leash holds him? Think of Job's court, the wilderness temptation, the demons begging at the sea's edge. All obey a limit they did not set. The leash is woven of law and presence. The law is the word, the presence is the name, and where these are honoured, the adversary is forced into obedience he cannot bear. This is the thread that will draw us into what comes next. For cast down does not mean unchained. That is why the rebel still walks into places you would think barred to him. The scene shifts, but the leash remains, and where law and presence bind, even the proudest spirit must yield. Job's ancient court shows it first. The sons of God present themselves before the Lord, and among them comes the accuser. He does not burst in. He enters on cue, answering when addressed, offering a report like a summoned official. Do you feel the irony? The same one who sought to overthrow the throne now stands in its audience chamber, asking permission before lifting a hand. The leash is visible if you know where to look. Zechariah saw it again. Joshua, the high priest, stands before the angel of the Lord, and at his right hand the accuser is ready to indict. Michael is there, his voice a boundary. The Lord rebuke you. Even in that moment, Satan does not protest the rebuke. He cannot. He obeys the legal force behind it. This is the terror he knows, that in the presence of the name, resistance collapses into compliance. Do you notice how often Scripture gives you this pattern, and how rarely pulpits name it? Permission sought in Job, silence in Zechariah, submission in the Gospels. The leash is short, but it is not broken. When Jesus stepped into Capernaum's synagogue, the demon cried out but did not touch him. Be silent and come out. The command landed like a chain, and it obeyed at once. On the eastern shore, a legion fell to its knees before the Son of God, begging to be sent into swine rather than the abyss. Even rebellion bargains under authority. That is why Satan fears these messengers. Michael, who enforces limits. Gabriel, who carries the word that draws them. Raphael, who restores what the limit protects. Together they close every door he tries to pry open. An old homily, copied in Greek and tucked into a collection of saints' lives, claims that Satan avoids certain places, not for lack of desire, but because the triad's offices are invoked there. Speculative? Yes, but it fits the record. From Eden's gate to the wilderness, to the empty tomb, his reach fails where God's authority is present. What do you think? If the rebel obeys under protest in heaven's court, how much more on earth when the same word is spoken, when the same war stands ready, when the same restoration waits at the edge of the battle? This is the truth your sermons rarely linger on. His freedom is procedural, not sovereign. He moves only within corridors permitted by the decree. That is why his rage is edged with dread, because every step he takes could be the one where the leash goes taut. And when that moment comes, whether in a court of light or in the dust of this world, the end is the same. He obeys. Even in exile, the dragon remembers them, not as distant memories, but as wounds that still throb. Raphael first. You might think him the least terrifying, yet his presence is the one the rebel cannot shake. He moves like water over scorched ground, and what was broken rises whole. This is not kindness the enemy can ignore. It is defiance of decay. Tobit's record, preserved in Greek and treasured in the Ethiopian canon, speaks of him driving out a spirit that chained a woman in grief, binding the destroyer and restoring sight. Speculative to some, yes, but the pattern is plain in Scripture itself. Healing comes in God's order, and where healing comes, rebellion loses its proof. Satan calls restoration an insult. It mocks the ruin he boasts of. Why tear if the tear will be mended until no seam shows? That is why he fears Raphael. Because every act of binding and mending is a verdict against him. Perhaps you were not told this in church, because someone preferred the healer to stay in the background, folded into safe metaphors. But the enemy knows him well. Gabriel is a different wound. The rebel knows him not as a courier, but as the voice that closes the case. Daniel saw him in visions, naming empires before they rose, unravelling dreams with authority no throne of man could claim. Zechariah heard his name in the temple, Mary, in a quiet room in Nazareth, each time the decree spoken, each time the path sealed. The enemy does not tremble at messages, He trembles at sentences, at the word that falls like a seal cooling to hardness. In the war, it was Gabriel's proclamation that marked the exile lawful. In the courts of Job and the wilderness with Christ, the same principle holds. Once the word is spoken under the name, the adversary cannot unmake it. This is why later generations softened him into a herald with folded wings, as if to blunt the edge. But you and I can still see the steel in his voice, if we read the texts without their softened glosses. And can you imagine the enemy hearing his own limits pronounced, knowing they will not be lifted? And then Michael. Here the terror peaks. Daniel calls him the great prince who stands for God's people. Revelation shows him leading the hosts. Jude shows him facing the devil over the body of Moses, invoking not his own power but the name. Satan remembers the line Michael draws. Remembers the moment strength, met strength, and his own failed. This is the dread that does not fade. Michael's certainty, not born of pride but obedience. When the leash tightens, it is Michael's grip that stops the advance. In the dragon's mind, the sight of Michael is the memory of the fall itself, the sensation of weight returning, of a throne receding forever. Even now, Scripture hints he will lead the last war, and the rebel knows it. Word, war, and restoration. These three have stood near the throne since before Eden, their offices unbroken, their unity mostly hidden in the margins of teaching. Yet the enemy knows them as one force, and if you see the pattern, you will see why he obeys when their authority is present. We were never meant to miss this, but it was cut from the record, blurred into tradition, hidden in monastery vaults under titles that keep the fearful edge from public sight. You are not most people. Look closely, and you will see why the dragon cannot stand where they stand. Under the long arc of history, the dragon has learned one thing he will never speak aloud. The pattern repeats. He has seen it in the garden at Sinai, in the courts of Babylon, in a manger under starlight, on a hill outside Jerusalem. Word, war, restoration. The triad that undid him once rises again and again, and each time he feels the old weight return. You might think his strategy would change, but the truth is darker. He cannot stop what he cannot touch. He watches for cracks, hoping the threefold cord will fray, and when it does not, the fear is the same as the day Michael pressed him to the rim of heaven. Look closely at the world now, when truth is spoken in the name, when courage stands without hatred, when wounds are bound in the strength of God's mercy. You are seeing the old pattern in modern light. That is why some prefer the angels blurred into allegory, why sermons keep them as background figures, why their offices are rarely named together, because the enemy knows the power of their unity. Do you? The early believers did. A mother in Rome whispered Psalm 91 to her child while soldiers searched the alleys. A merchant in Antioch refused to renounce Christ's name before the magistrate. A slave in Carthage washed the wounds of his master after the master had beaten him. Word, war, restoration, not in angelic form, but in the church, mirroring heaven's order. And Satan feared it then as he does now, because the same authority that cast him down was walking in human skin. He fears it in you, if you will take it up. In a different century, an underground church in China met in a cramped apartment while state informants listened through the walls. They sang without sound, mouthing hymns in unison, their eyes fixed on a single open Bible under a dim bulb. In that silence, the dragon recognized the same terror he had felt in heaven. Word, war, restoration in human hearts, and not a chain on earth could stop it. That is the unspoken terror. When Michael's resolve becomes the believer's courage, when Gabriel's decree becomes the Christian's confession, when Raphael's mending becomes the work of the faithful, in those moments he knows his time is shorter than it was. Can you feel the countdown? Not in hours or years, but in the gathering of a strategy that has never failed him, only defeated him. That is why Revelation shows the war flaring again at the end, Michael rising one last time. Not in defense of heaven's floor, but in open judgment of the earth, his command breaking the air like a verdict too loud to ignore. The dragon will not mistake that voice. He will remember the first time it drove him back, and he will know the second will end him. Will you stand where they stood, or step back and let the pattern pass you by? You have seen the pattern now. Before there was dust, before rivers carved the earth, before the first breath drew life into clay, there was order, word, war, restoration, and in that order stood three whose presence the dragon could not bear. You know their names now, though he would rather you did not. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael. You have traced the moment when ambition turned to rebellion, when mercy was refused, when war rang out and the rebel was cast down. And you have seen that casting down is not erasure, that his voice still moves in the corridors where God allows, but always stops where the authority stands. This is why he still yields, not willingly, but inevitably. Because wherever the word is spoken in the name, war stands without hatred, and restoration moves without delay. The leash is woven of law and presence, and he cannot break it. The old records are thin on this point, trimmed or blurred, because the enemy would prefer you think resistance is random, that victory is a matter of luck or willpower. But now you know it is ordered. Now you have seen the strategy that once drove him out and will end him still. Does that change the way you hear the final conflict in Revelation, when Michael rises and the dragon rages knowing his time is short? It should. Because what terrified him in the courts of light terrifies him still when it appears in the church, in the home, in the solitary believer who will not step back. This is why the leash holds, why the accuser falls silent, why the healer binds, why the king remains unmoved. The question is no longer whether the triad will stand. The question is whether you will stand with them. If this journey stirred something in you, do not let it vanish in the noise. There are more whispers hidden in Scripture's pages, waiting to be uncovered. Stay with us, subscribe, listen closer, and keep walking this narrow road between thunder and silence. I look forward to seeing you again.